Good evening. It's a real privilege to conduct a webinar for Georgetown Wargaming Society. Um, I hope that this presentation will be of use not only for the military aspects of gaming, but for the wider application of it, as many of you may decide to involve yourself in. Um, Although my early professional years were spent flying single-seat jets from aircraft carriers, I eventually migrated into the world of professional military education. Not having been a very good student at the undergraduate level, my entry into academia can be seen as kind of a black swan, or if not downright paradox. But nonetheless, I made a go of it, collecting a couple of master's degrees and eventually becoming director of wargaming, the wargaming department at the Naval War College, and eventually the dean of the college's research arm, the Center for Naval Warfare Studies. Throughout my more than 2 decades of service in professional military education, I was more or less constantly involved with wargaming in one way or another, ranging from a game designer to umpire to director to sponsor to analyst to chairman of the wargaming department at the college, and eventually to overall administrator of the college's research effort, of which gaming was a crucial element. We used wargaming for any number of purposes up at Newport, including at times simple entertainment. But the function I want to reflect on in this seminar is supporting education. My interest in this respect is due to my concern that the Naval War College is not providing the Navy with the kind of professional education the fleet needs. Specifically, it's not using wargaming to its fullest advantage. Understanding how wargaming can better be used as an educational tool is the thrust of my remarks today, which I hope will stimulate an interesting and useful dialogue later in the webinar. To understand the connection between wargaming and professional education, at least in the Navy, we've got to review a little history. In 1884, Commodore Stephen B. Luce founded the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. The white building in the foreground is the original site, formerly the Newport Poorhouse. But over the years, the college grew organically to include most of the buildings you see in this picture. My domain as the dean of the Center for Naval Warfare Studies was the modern building with the light blue roof, McCarty Little Hall, named after the officer who introduced wargaming to the college in 1887. Note Luce's vision of the college, a place of original research. At the time of the founding, the college had virtually nothing to teach in the way of existing naval principles or doctrine. The Navy was just starting to come out of the post-Civil War doldrums. The emergence of a multipolar world was beginning to raise security concerns in the Western Hemisphere, and the nation was starting to invest in a new kind of Navy composed of steel ships. Unlike the Royal Navy, the US Navy had no history of fleet warfare and so had to discover for itself what a modern fleet should look like and how it should be used. Wargaming was employed as a research tool because it could validly explore the problems that possessed high degrees of what Dr. John Hanley called structural indeterminacy, not knowing what all the variables were or even the precise nature of the problem itself. To reiterate, the War College did not know what to teach about operations and strategies in the late 1800s. Thus, as a service, it had an open mind, and the college's adoption of gaming fit perfectly with the need to grapple with the complex and unstructured problem of how it should evolve to protect US strategic interests. The United States was starting to come out of its continental cocoon, and in the 1890 publication of Naval War College faculty member Alfred Thayer Mahan's The Influence of Sea Power on History, gained notoriety for the college, especially after Theodore Roosevelt read the book. Research in gaming at the college was conducted by students and attained influence in Washington. After World War I, Admiral William Sims returned to the college, and the games there supported a series of fleet battle experiments that helped prepare the Navy for World War II. To boot, virtually all the admirals that had command in the Pacific in World War II participated in those games. After the war, Admiral Nimitz said that the war with Japan had been gamed so many times and in so many ways that nothing that happened was a surprise except the kamikazes. While that's probably an overstatement, there was clearly a symbiotic relationship between professional military education, wargaming, and fleet development. To give you a sense of the symbiotic relationship between wargaming and the Navy's evolution, I'll cite the story of USS Langley, the Navy's first aircraft carrier. Admiral William Sims, who had been commander of the U.S. naval forces in Europe in World War I, came back as an aviation enthusiast after seeing HMS Argus. He gave up 2 of his 4 stars in order to reoccupy the position of president of the Naval War College, which he had left to go to Europe. He directed that war games be conducted to explore the use of aviation in naval warfare. Over the course of several years, those games revealed the potential of carrier-based air power to be a decisive factor. The games indicated that it was critical for aircraft carriers to generate as many sorties as possible and a pulse of strike power. The game reports were read by Rear Admiral Bill Moffett, director of the Bureau of Aeronautics. By the early 1920s, USS Langley had been decommissioned and experiments were being run out in San Diego. However, she could only operate a dozen or so aircraft because they had to keep the deck clear in case an aircraft missed the arresting wires or broke a hook. When an aircraft landed, it had to be struck below on the elevator and the elevator raised again before the next aircraft could land. By the time it was number 12's turn, he was running on fumes. Moffett, understanding that naval aviation could not progress unless this situation was rectified, had Captain Joseph Reeves, head of the tactics, or what is now the wargaming department at the Naval War College, detailed out to San Diego as commander of aircraft squadrons with explicit instructions to find a solution. Within 6 months, the midships barricade was invented and Langley was then able to operate more than 40 aircraft, and the rest is history. Here we see an example of the Navy staff, or OPNAV, Naval War College Fleet Synergistic Triangle. That symbiosis between wargaming and the larger Navy existed up through the start of World War II. Moreover, all the admirals in the Pacific, as I said, except one, had gone to the college and had the common experience of the games and the course. But then it all went to hell. After the war, the Navy was left in total command of all the seas, and the new world was characterized by rapidly developing technology, including jet aircraft and nuclear weapons. The Navy was not searching for how to build a fleet anymore. It had the largest and best in the world. But an avalanche of new technologies, including nuclear weapons, guided missiles, nuclear submarines, and others, drove the locus of research to the laboratories and vice the game floor. Gaming in the War College itself drifted, and gaming became focused on integrating new electronic technology to gaming to the detriment of strategy. Then in 1979, due to a rising Soviet Navy and the influence of Admiral Thomas Hayward, the college ran a war game to explore what a global war with the Soviets would be like. The big revelation at the time was that the war might plausibly remain conventional. Thus, naval strategy became relevant again. The Navy decided to pull that string further, and for the next 10 years, the global games progressively explored deeper into such a war. These games were key in supporting the development of the famous 1980s maritime strategy. After the strategy's promulgation in 1986, the games continued to explore various aspects of strategy and fleet design until the Soviet Union imploded. The separation of teaching and research was formalized by the establishment of the Center for Naval Warfare Studies in 1981. The global games continued after the USSR went away, but now they had no strategic purchase and their focus became narrowly operational and divorced from the overall Navy interests. The games became ritualistic, ultimately becoming contractor expos before being canceled in 2001. There was still plenty of gaming going on in the Navy, but it was carried on by a host of different organizations. And while various games may have had local utility, there was no overall policy or strategy for doing them. A symptom of the gaming malaise was the shift of student games to rather anodyne joint planning exercises to support the school's joint education accreditation. There are, of course, a lot more moving parts to this story, but a couple of things stand out. First, a coherent strategy between wargaming and Navy policy and strategy was driven by external circumstances, specifically a true naval opponent. One would think that the rise of the Chinese Navy would be the impetus for a new synergy, and while there's certainly an uptick in gaming in China scenarios, I do not see the institutional synergy emerging. Second, whereas the previous synergies were created in a bottom-up manner, with wargaming catching the interest of Navy leadership, today the need is probably for top-down influence. Here we see a couple of pictures from the wargaming's history. There are some interesting elements in the 1887 lithograph. First and foremost of importance is the fact that most of the officers in the picture are students, because research and wargaming were important constituents of the curriculum at the time. It's also interesting to note the map on the wall, Cuba and its surroundings, the enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine and the protection of an incipient Panama Canal being the hot geopolitical topics of the time. We see that the game board was a door laid upon two sawhorses. Finally, we note that the officer in white is Swedish. He is talking to an Army officer, and there are two Chinese observers in the background. From the start, the college's games were inclusive because a broad range of perspectives produced the best strategic research and best education. I include the 1947 picture to illustrate the evolution of gaming at the college. Wargaming had become much more than a simple map exercise. It was now a rather intricate and tedious representation of naval warfare down to the tactical level. In order to make the gaming process less tedious, the college invested considerable amounts of money and time over the course of the 1950s through the early 2000s in an attempt to computerize the gaming process, mostly with only mixed success. And when I was chairman of gaming, I invested a lot of money in trying to adopt everything from genetic algorithms to other kinds of mathematics to improve the computerized adjudication process, and it never worked out. For now, I want to emphasize that up through the early 1940s, student research was fused with the college's teaching curriculum, but that would change, which is the source of my current concerns. The 2022 photo depicts a recreation of the Battle of Jutland, undertaken by some Naval War College wargaming faculty to replicate the decision analysis methods employed at the Naval War College in the 1920s and 30s. Interestingly, as the game was being developed, a number of War College teaching faculty did not understand why the game was being staged. One dean said, "We don't do that here." Indeed. The separation of teaching and research via wargaming has developed deep roots. The quote reflects dangerous hubris. Wargaming, even seemingly anachronistic recreations of a century-old battle, is an open-ended process capable of producing unanticipated insights. Warfare and strategy being the complex and evolving things that they are, the college necessarily remains in an information deficit, but apparently the dean who issued the assertion was unaware of that. My view is that in education, everybody's a student, even the most senior faculty, whether they like to think so or not. This certainly holds for game designers. I've been involved in virtually all aspects of professional military education, ranging from being a student to classroom instructor to member of a joint staff accreditation team to an administrator. Upon many years of reflection, I've arrived at these principles that you see here. All of these are essentially derived from Commodore Luce's original vision for the War College. While the college's mission was multifaceted, one key element was, and has been ever since, preparing officers to command in combat. How does one do that? Here I'm going to offer a quote from the book Chaos by James Gleick. He says, "When scientists moved from the Mandelbrot set itself to new problems of representing real physical phenomena, the qualities of the set's boundary came to the fore. The boundary between two or more attractors in a dynamical system served as a threshold of a kind that seems to govern so many ordinary processes, from breaking of materials to the making of decisions." Now, granted, I'm treading on metaphorical thin ice here, but I do think one can invoke at least a whiff of chaos at the threshold that separates decision-making in peacetime from its practice in war. In other words, there's no straightforward linkage between peacetime professional military education and at least as currently conducted, and the expected performance of officers in wartime. You cannot teach Clausewitz's coup d'oeil or warfighting instinct. It must be emerged from within the officer. Just as you cannot teach it, you cannot reliably select for it in advance. What then is to be done if we want our Armed Forces Officer Corps to be as combat ready as we can make it? My conclusion is that command ability cannot be engineered. Its emergence in an officer can only be facilitated via the principles that I list. And the bottom bullet is key. The facilitation of command capability is a problem with a high degree of indeterminacy, and thus wargaming as a research tool appropriate to such problems is the key educational tool. Enhancing a person's decision-making capability, regardless of profession, and critically under conditions of stress is a complex business involving any number of facets. Wargaming as a relatively unstructured tool provides a host of potential benefits, this list inevitably being partial. Most of these benefits are self-explanatory, but perhaps I should expand a little on intellectual calisthenics. Another way to put this is the building of habits of mind. This is a sense in which traditionally the games of chess and Go were taught to sharpen a person's strategic thinking skills. I'd be hard pressed to nail down exactly how participation in wargaming would do this, but it is my opinion that the value derived from having to make decisions in a competitive environment, even if it is artificial and simulated, is substantial. The use of seminar discussion and case studies, as is almost universal in current professional military education, only produces a couple of these benefits, mostly familiarization and organization and knowledge. The way wargaming is currently used, it is done in a way that fails to achieve anything else. But truly effective wargaming is hard and threatening to faculty whose status is based on knowledge, not necessarily on the ability to think quickly in the context of controlling a game cell. Gaming chews up time and cannot reliably cover a set of material. Excuse me. But then I will offer this quote from a recent book on the influence of the British naval strategist Julian Corbett. He says, career-long self-education is critical to preparing for an unpredictable future. Overcrowded courses crammed with endless lectures, exercises, directed study, and delivery might be easy to administer, control, and assess, generating comfortingly rigorous numerical scores. Excuse me. But they're a poor substitute for intelligent programs which encourage students to develop. I would add that war games do not reliably teach. Instead, they offer a pathway for development. Perhaps some of the education majors in the audience will be familiar with these two taxonomies, which were articulated in the 1950s. They were and perhaps still are useful, but they were profoundly misused in the codification of joint education learning objectives in the 1990s. Perhaps most egregiously, the objectives involving wargaming were limited to the application level of learning. Thus, at virtually all service colleges, the end-of-course wargames were designed to A, provide an opportunity to apply the concepts introduced in the course, and B, synthesize the various elements of the course. At Newport, for example, the end-of-course game became simply a joint planning exercise with no element of competition included. In my view, conducting a two-sided game that involves true competition is too open-ended and chaotic for the tastes of teaching faculty who want to cover the material and do not want to be placed into anomalous situations that forces them to think on their feet. Such games are also anathema to bureaucrats who want to ensure a predictable educational outcome. But war games are a useful tool for shifting the educational process from the industrial paradigm to the information paradigm. Let me stir the pot a bit and offer a different way of categorizing war games by their functions, one that perhaps better highlights my argument here today. Games can function as a kind of sensor. That is, for instance, they can reveal defects in a plan. The Army commonly uses them in this way, including everything from simple rock drills to extensive Title X games. The second function is catalyst. The game is meant to generate organizational or policy change of some kind. In the early 2000s, the Naval War College ran a series of games to solidify support for the Proliferation Security Initiative. We also ran a long-running series of maritime homeland security games to help generate unity of purpose and effort among the array of government agencies concerned with homeland maritime security. The third function is as a substrate for command and control experiments. We conducted a simple experiment along this line using the computer game Scud Hunt, in which time required to find all the scuds was recorded for different kinds of player organizations. The 1999 to 2001 global games at the Naval War College were substrates, or at least vehicles for discovering how shared awareness propagated throughout a network. Finally, and this is a function of most interest right now, is as a sandbox, a place where players can literally play, trying out things in a risk-free environment. When I speak of player experimentation in the context of gaming, this is what I have in mind. I think that categorizing a game in this way offers useful guidance for game designers. I'm not here to advocate for one gaming system over another, but simply to share my experiences with respect to the environments created by the different approaches to gaming. To get that discussion going, let me offer a quote by Sharang Biswas, a professor of game design at Fordham and New York University. He says, "I don't like the conversation about how games are the best way to learn things. Games are another way to learn things. What makes them unique is that they allow you to do so in an experiential way that is different from just watching or listening. And I would say discussing and arguing." He continues, "Many of them engage the body in a way that feels different. A book can transport you through lyrical language. A game transports you because your body is performing the motions. Analog games use the body as a tool, and all games use procedure as a way to transport you into the world of the game." Now, I think his assertion that analog games use the body as a tool is important. In board games, the physical movement of pieces, the rolling of dice, and even the reading of the rules envelops players in the game in a different way than manipulating a keyboard and sorting through menus. In between are games that in which all the moves and calculations are made by umpires and are invisible to players. Again, I'm not talking about better or worse, but different. I could spend hours going through the various incidents and vignettes I have observed over the years, but let me share a couple that I think are illustrative. Board games, by and large, lays their guts on the table. The combination of geographical features on the game board, the numbers printed on the pieces, the rules, the combat results tables, and the dice are all explicitly indicate why something happened the way it did. This explicitness can seem rigid and confining, but it can produce educational gold at times. In a simple literal combat ship game Peter Perla and his crew designed for me, combat outcomes were generated by dice rolls and combat results table. At one point, one of my students kept rolling ones and getting smeared by the bad guys. After the fourth adverse roll, he exclaimed in frustration, "This is a dice game, not a war game." Indeed. This produced a golden opportunity to lead a discussion about the limitations inherent in using dice rolls to represent unsimulated factors such as human errors or just bad luck. The physical roll of dice led to a deeper understanding of the embedded complexities of warfare. This could not have happened if the game was based on a computer simulation, because the dice rolls would have been invisible to the players. In the 2001 Global War game, we attempted to simulate a real-time operational level common operational picture in the game cells. 100 umpires and controllers manning many consoles on the game floor were busy translating manual umpire move adjudications into symbols that constituted the common operational picture. In the Naval Component Commander cell, strikes were ordered on an enemy missile site that the umpires were adjudicated as being successful. This feedback was transmitted by telephone from the game floor to the player cell, but through miscommunication on the game floor, the symbol for the missile site remained depicted as active. Now, the maritime commander, a one-star admiral, knew that this part of his common operational picture was wrong, so he wondered what other elements were in error. At that point, he rejected the whole picture and reverted to using paper maps and butcher board to support his situational awareness. This produced highly useful discussions subsequently about the dynamics of using partially compromised computer displays and fighting via networks that were not 100%. This couldn't have happened in a board game. So I guess there's a couple of points to be made. First, experiencing different gaming systems is like getting a variety of nutrients. It produces healthier education. Of course, it's not possible to orchestrate situations like I just described, but repeated exposure to both systems is likely to produce some outcomes that a savvy professor can leverage. Second, Professor Biswaa's point about the physical aspect of gaming is one that ought to be considered when designing educational games. Now, this odd slide depicts what I regard as a very important aspect of educational gaming. It stems from years of wargaming after the fall of the Soviet Union. Our games at the War College necessarily shifted to regional contingencies like a North Korean invasion of the South and aggression by various players in the Middle East. In every case, the scenario featured a very strong US capability pitted against a relatively weak opponent, at least in terms of conventional combat power. After a decade or more of designing and directing, as well as analyzing and simply observing such games, a couple of patterns emerged. First, whether a game was one or two-sided, we found that it was hard to adjudicate moves because the weaker red would couch its moves in strategic and political terms, vice operational level. This was because red had no chance simply trying to match blue tank for tank, fighter for fighter, or ship for ship. Thus, red had to devise ways to sidestep blue's conventional superiority. Red teams tended to do this by things like special operations, sabotage within the continental US, political demarches, and the use of a nuclear bomb when they had them. Blue, on the other hand, would focus its moves on operational maneuvers of conventional forces. I remember vividly one game that involved all the senior war colleges played at Maxwell Air Force Base for a week in the spring. The various blue commands were played by students from the service colleges, and red was played by National War College students. After 6 moves, conducted over the course of a week, we would hold a hot wash where red and blue would take turns discussing their strategies. In this one game, the red PRC cell had deftly maneuvered the North Korean cell into using nuclear weapons in a certain way that had the effect of painting the blue National Command Authority into a difficult political corner, needing PRC help to restrain the North Korean junkyard dog. The blue players entered the brief confident that they had won the game through competent conventional operations. As red briefed their strategy, you could see the faces of the blue players fall. They hadn't seen it coming. The revelation of the horrible truth set up a wonderful opportunity for me to run a subsequent seminar for my students on the relationship between the operational and strategic levels of war. This opportunity would not have occurred had red not suffered a weak hand in terms of conventional capability. Weakness forced them to devise a creative asymmetrical strategy. A subsequent series of highly classified games exploring deterrence and escalation revealed to me another phenomenon associated with conventional military superiority, which I'll call the illusions of strength. The games featured current and retired senior government officials as players. These folks were divided into red and blue teams and given a scenario that featured an ongoing conventional conflict that had the possibility of going nuclear. The two sides not only developed moves for their respective forces, they also issued demarches and political messages. Bear in mind that players of both sides were senior professionals that had worked together or at least were familiar with each other due to years of government service. You would think that there would be no problem with blue players receiving and interpreting signaling by red. Over the course of several games run once a year, I saw a pattern emerge. Blue consistently misinterpreted or missed red signaling, which is surprising to me given the players' professional and social relationships. What I finally decided was that the blue players saw things through the lens of their conventional superiority, and that seemed to distort their perceptions. Plus, they reflexively tried to solve their strategic problems via their conventional military strength. Thus, despite existing personal and professional familiarity with the red players, a communication gap developed. What does all this mean for educational gaming? I think forcing students to play a war game from a position of relative weakness stimulates creative thinking, whether or not they accurately depict actual red doctrine. When a faculty member detects blue falling prey to the illusions of strength, they should leverage it. Ideally, students should play both sides. Quite aside from any other factors such as game system or scenario, the strong/weak dynamic is a powerful element of the logic of warfare that wargaming can bring out and should be used as a profound educational tool by faculty. One last observation on this subject. If you look at the totality of conflict, you see that the overarching context is the dispute. Disputes can not only be of many kinds and intensity, but conflict begins with the onset of the dispute and only ends with its resolution. Warfare is a subset of the range of measures a nation might employ to resolve the dispute on its terms. The elements of a dispute include many factors, relative military strength being only one. Thus it is that a nation that enjoys military superiority may, for any number of reasons, be holding a weak hand politically and economically. The balanced scorecard, as it were, of a nation's advantages and disadvantages with regard to a dispute will govern the relationship that could exist between military operations and strategy and the desired political outcome of the dispute. In my view, the critical weakness in the professional military education system is that these relationships are not addressed in any meaningful way. To a substantial degree, the relationships involve emotion, values, and instinct. Forcing students to wargame from a position of weakness of some sort is a way of getting at that side of the strategy. Having to deal with weakness in some form is meant, among other things, to stimulate creativity. Imposed constraints could offer the same benefit. Constraints come in various forms. A historical example is the stimulus the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty, and notably the non-fortification clause embedded in it, had on American fleet design. The treaty imposed severe limits on the building and modernization of battleships, and the non-fortification clause was meant as a way to secure Japanese acceptance of an adverse naval tonnage ratio, prohibited American base and fortification building in the Philippines. These constraints forced the U.S. Navy designers to get creative about fleet design, and that resulted in outstanding classes of aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines that sustained the U.S. Navy's defensive operation in the first 2 years of the subsequent war. Moreover, it forced U.S. planners to consider how to provide expeditionary logistics for the fleet across the wide expanse of the Pacific. So it is worthwhile to consider imposing some form of constraints within the scenario of an educational war game, be they political, geographic, or economic. Making players deal with adversity is like giving them intellectual vitamins. The second source of constraints in a war game is the rules themselves. A few years back, I published an article in the Moore's magazine, Phalanx, that described the role of war game rules as intellectual stimuli. My argument stemmed from experience I had teaching a wargaming theory and practice elective at Newport. I had asked Peter Perla and his team to design for me a board game that I could use to illustrate the various aspects of wargame design. They produced a Korean War game that we called the Wargaming Construction Kit. Wanting to bring the representation of intangibles into the process, I asked them to somehow represent the exigencies of command and control. In computer simulations, this is frequently done by imposing delays on force movement and fighting. That would not work in a board game, so Peter adopted a budget metaphor. Players would have a limited number of command and control points which had to be spent to get their forces to move or fight. The constraint on numbers of available points was intended to represent the span of attention and control exigencies involved in C2. Well, the North Korean Navy player hit on the idea of sending his diesel subs to sea, not to attack blue forces, but to get lost and force blue to expend scarce C2 points searching for them, points that would not be available for more threatening operations against red. Red would announce his subs had deployed, but nothing else. Blue would have to expend C2 points to buy dice rolls to search for the subs. At this point, the umpire, being in on the scheme, would have to find some excuse for negating any blue dice roll that would normally result in a detection. At first glance, this appears to be an instance of gaming the game. I thought so also until I remembered the headaches a single unlocated Argentine Type 209 sub caused the British task force in 1982. The British expended almost all their ASW weapons on false contacts. Here was an indication that the old strategy of fleet and being was not quite dead. In other words, the constraint on C2 established by the game rule generated some excellent creative thinking on the part of the Red Navy player. A kind of first cousin to constraints in terms of generating creativity in wargaming is the Deus Ex Machina, a scenario twist inserted at some point in the game. The TV show Survivor uses this all the time to create interest. We used it in a 6-week-long war game in 2006. That was part of the Cooperative Strategy for 21st Century Sea Power development effort. 5 weeks of back and forth between our strategic entities had not produced anything we could get purchase on in terms of a pivotal idea around which a strategy could coalesce. In week number 6, we inserted a number of injects, deus ex machina, just to stimulate responses. One was that Taiwan had peacefully reunited with China. The reaction of the China cell was dramatic. It became cooperative, vice confrontational. Remember, this was 2006. The blinding flash of the obvious hit us. It's the system, stupid. All nations had a stake in one way or another of the proper operation of the global system in all its facets. This provided the key pivot for the strategy document the sea services would deploy to defend the system. While that was a research game, it's easy to see how a deus ex machina could be used to stimulate creative thought in an educational game. Any game, in a very real sense, is a fishing expedition. You never really know what will come out of it. And this is precisely the point in education gaming, the good kind. The goal is to generate creative thought skills in a competitive environment. It doesn't matter so much what a player comes up with. It is the process of coming up with something that develops a skill. An implication of this is that such an approach to education is inherently cumulative. Individual events can only be related by their incremental increase in the desired effect. Too often, games are regarded as either decisive events or perhaps the culmination of a sequential process of seminars, lectures, and reading. But a one-time shot lowers the probability that some kind of useful epiphany will occur in a player. More gaming is better. Education game designers would be well advised to consider the deep learning potential of weakness and constraints. Such elements are not, in the strictest sense, realistic, but as can be seen from my examples, they did produce important insights on the relationship of thinking to the real world. Having to deal with weakness in some form is meant, among other things, to simulate creativity. Imposed constraints could offer the same benefit. Constraints come in various forms. An historical example is let's see here. I got to go back. I apologize. I'll end this part of the presentation with a few thoughts about the faculty that I assume would be sponsoring and hopefully deeply involved in educational gaming. Unlike a Sidewinder missile, an educational war game is not a fire and forget weapon. Throughout the process, from game conception and design through controlling, umpiring, and overall direction to post-game discussions, the faculty must remain intimately involved. This is not easy on a number of counts. Wargaming is time-consuming in all its phases, a real opportunity cost for hard-pressed faculty. While I regard the rewards as worth it, faculty accustomed to the routine of seminar teaching will find it an onerous intrusion. More problematic is the fact that a two-sided war game is unpredictable and will not reliably cover planned material. A game is an investment in thinking, and just like venture capital investments, returns cannot be guaranteed. It is a process that ups the odds that at least some students will benefit hugely from the experience in a way far beyond what more traditional form of instruction can produce. Finally, and perhaps most challenging for faculty used to the controlled environment of the lecture hall or seminar room, is the fact that since war games are unpredictable, faculty acting as cell controllers and advisors, not to mention umpires, must think on their feet and find ways on the fly to make educational hay based on the happenings in the game. This is threatening for many faculty whose professional corpus is built on knowledge, articulation, and research. Games are dynamic and require inspired reaction by faculty as they are played. Moreover, realizing the most benefit from games requires astute, incisive observation by faculty to recognize learning opportunities as they arise. Probably this all requires a different breed of cat than you'd normally find in the halls of academia. Certainly, I encountered almost feral opposition to my proposals for two-sided gaming at Newport, and at present, the end of course games are not really games, but planning exercises that are designed to illustrate principles introduced in the course and give students a chance to apply them. A massively useful educational opportunity is thus lost, and the obstacle is the faculty. Now, this is a kind of a weird way to close a discussion on educational wargaming, but I think it offers a good jumping off point for further thinking about educational wargaming. So first, I'll assert that creative further thinking on a topic is one of the most desirable products of educational wargaming. Second, I will use another sea story to illustrate the idea. Back in 2013, the Naval War College was asked to host a global coordination meeting among the Navy's most senior admirals. The Chief of Naval Operations, having earlier attended a joint version hosted by the chairman of the Joint Staff, who was an Army general, they used a gigantic world map laid out in a gym as a basis for discussion. The CNO liked it and asked the college to prepare a similar map to support the meeting. Our large 24 by 44 foot map was printed in 4 sections of 90 degrees of longitude each, able to be Velcroed together in any order. For convenience, my faculty laid it out in this way to facilitate placement of the hundreds of models and markers needed to represent the entire Navy. Looking down on the map from the auditorium balcony, I realized the map was telling me something important. First, the US was split down the Mississippi River. Beyond the physical convenience for placing markers, it implied that between New York and Los Angeles, there was nothing of real geopolitical interest happening. But that was just a start. Excuse me. My initial insight was that the US Navy does not deploy out from the US, rather it converges on Eurasia. This has major implications for Navy coordination and strategic planning, but also offers some additional geopolitical perspective, the detail of which there's not time to address here. The meeting was what the Army calls a rock drill, an elemental form of proto game that focuses on the positions of things rather than the dynamics of moves. We did not expect to derive a new global strategic insight from the map layout, but we did. Its intent was to facilitate discussion, but it produced much more, a new basis for thinking strategically. And I hope my examples along the way have convinced you that any game can produce the unexpected, which is, after all, a key focus of education, the ability to deal constructively with the unexpected. This is not to say that games are not useful to support training, which they indeed are, but to move students, faculty, and institutions to the pinnacle of Bloom's learning taxonomy, educational games, not simply cleverly designed, but directed and exploited with creativity and genius, are powerful tools if we have the curiosity and courage to employ them. I also found out that size matters when it comes to maps. We made another map of at the same physical size, but depicting only the Persian Gulf and Northern Arabian Sea. I was showing our librarian the map one day, and he asked me whether ships out in the Northern Arabian Sea could see others coming out of the Straits of Hormuz. That led me to show him the meaning of scale of the map. Even with radar, I said, on this map, a ship would have to be within about an inch of something to see it. An E-2 early warning airplane would be stationed at 30,000 feet, which on this map would be about the top of my shoe sole. Low Earth orbiting satellites would be about the height of my shin. Given their normal aperture, they are still looking at the world through a soda straw. All of a sudden, a whole lot of things made sense to him. Big maps seem to create more involvement too. Players have to pad around in socks and they can move around to view the situation from different perspectives. This latter factor is non-trivial in my book, and so I ordered a number of large LCD display screens for some game cells that could be pivoted horizontal for just this reason. Going back to the Doron sawhorses that you saw in 1887. Educational gaming's prime objective is to open the mind, and any measure you can take to facilitate that process is worthwhile. All right, I've gotten through a rather long presentation. here are some references. These are articles that I think are pretty good. And maybe Sebastian can share them with you. Another one. So with that, I'll quit talking and respond to questions.
Hey, Barney, that was great. Thank you. So I have several questions I'll go through. For those in the chat, I might bounce around some of your questions, try to keep them thematic. So bear with me. I have not forgotten any of your questions. I'll get to them, I promise. Right. So the first one I want to ask is referencing your the World War II games and the carrier of the Langley that you mentioned. It says, did they war game a composition of the carrier aircraft in terms of different mixes in terms of fighters and bombers versus scouts? The US had a very different configuration than the Japanese. The US had more scouts, and the question is, like, was this a key element of the wargaming during the interwar period at the Naval War College?
Well, eventually it was. Now the specific games of the from 1919 to the early 20s, I don't know if they worked on air wing composition or not. The kind of the key thing to those games was the assumption that in the somewhat near future, aircraft would be capable of carrying 500 or 1,000-pound bombs, which would be the ones powerful enough to damage or sink a capital ship, a battleship. It was that was the focus of the gaming. Later on, I think they did experiment with different composition, air wing compositions. Although when it, air wing composition actually changed quite a bit during World War II based on experience. They went from kind of a 50-50 fighter bomber / torpedo planes split to an air wing composition that was at least 60% fighters as the war went on.
So you mentioned how the fleet and the Naval War College and its gaming were connected. Could you expand a little bit more how those were connected during the interwar period?
Yeah, well, it was both a matter of organization and a matter of personalities. The Navy, and I can't remember the exact year, established the General Board, which is an advisory board in Washington, and included on that board was the president of the Naval War College, and they gave advice to the Chief of Naval Operations on what new ship designs, et cetera, to adopt. So you had the linkage of the Naval War College and retired admirals and OPNAV, and then you had the other connection where you had Captain Joe Reeves, who was head of wargaming at the Naval War College, being sent out by Admiral Bill Moffett, who was chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, to San Diego to figure out how to increase the sortie capability of Langley. Well, Joe Reeves went out to be a 4-star admiral, and he was a key figure in designing and executing the series of fleet battle experiments that occurred in the 1920s and 30s. So you had this both, and then, as I said, virtually all the admirals in World War II in the Pacific were graduates of the Naval War College and had been probably back to Newport several times to participate in games. So it was both an organizational lash up and a personality lash up, which I guarantee does not exist today.
So on that note, someone else asked is, how can we get back to connecting or creating that institutional connection, whether it's on the individual level or at the organizational level?
Yeah, the drum I've been banging on, the windmills I've been tilting at, is to shift the junior course. There's 2 curricula at the Naval War College: the intermediate level and the senior level. The intermediate levels for lieutenant commanders and majors, et cetera, and the senior level is for commanders and captains, or lieutenant colonels and colonels. I won't go into the long history of this, but basically both courses are the same. I mean, there's differences in emphasis and a few this and that, but basically they're both the same. And they are focused on strategy. It's very academic. They produce a master's degree. They're accredited, and also tragically their content is dictated quite a bit by the requirements of joint professional military education credit. That elbows out a lot of stuff they should be doing and are not. Specifically, I want the junior course to be changed to a year-long classified wargaming centric warfighting course. The graduates of that will be more effective in designing and executing fleet battle experiments. Those guys will eventually find their way to billets in the Pentagon, and you'll have people that understand the triangle. Right now, the connection between the Navy staff and the War College is that the Navy staff sponsors war games, but those war games are conducted by the Center for Naval Warfare Studies, which is separate from the teaching faculty. The only real connection back in 2001, when I was hired as a civilian at the War College as an analyst, I started a advanced study group for a few students called the Halsey Group that did classified repeated war gaming on a potential war with China. And they've been doing it for 20 some years now. I won't go into the details of that, but that produces a few of those guys per year, but not a critical mass. To the start of building a new set of connections is to change the course at the War College, the junior course, to a classified warfighting course.
So related to that, right? So you mentioned some of the challenges in your presentation throughout the history of educational wargaming at the college and the Navy writ large a little bit. So what are some of the key challenges, like the top 3, let's say, challenges to institutionalizing educational wargaming at the college or the fleet more writ large? You mentioned some of the windmills you're tilting at. What are some of those windmills, the biggest ones?
Well, the biggest one I would say is the structure of the curriculum there. The curriculum for both the intermediate and senior levels consists of 3 independent core courses: strategy and policy, national security decision-making, and joint maritime or joint military operations, each being about 13 weeks long, roughly. The course was adopted installed at the War College in 1972. Admiral Stan Turner was the guy that sort of revolutionized the War College and made it very academic. And he brought in top-notch civilian faculty. And the college, this curriculum has a very good reputation around the world as the most rigorous of the War College's curricula. It was established originally for the senior course, but then the juniors saw it and liked it, and they wanted it too. So what the War College did, which is kind of genius, was to present the courses in different order to the seniors and juniors. So the senior course will start with national security decision making in the fall trimester, go to strategy and policy in the winter, and then joint military ops in the spring. The juniors will start with strategy and policy in the fall, go to joint military ops in the winter, and then finish up with national security decision-making in the spring. That means the same faculty can teach both the junior and senior level courses. This made sense because the Bureau of Naval Personnel hates sending naval officers to the Naval War College. They figure officers have no business doing that. They need to learn their business at sea. Now they've been forced to do it because of joint educational requirements. But the reason why both courses are like they are is because the same faculty can teach both courses, and it's had a good reputation. Nobody seems to want to ask whether the college is doing the right thing for the Navy at now. I mean, that course is 50 years old in its structure. So to change the structure of the junior course, they would have to get a whole separate faculty for the junior course, and change their facilities a bit, because both courses right now are unclassified, and then figure out what to do with the international students. I came up with a solution for that, but again, it's fallen on deaf ears. But so the biggest obstacle is the inherent structure of the curriculum as it stands. The secondly, as I talked about, is the attitude of the faculty. Even trying to get two-sided gaming into the current curriculum was a bridge too far for the faculty. Back when I was an instructor in planning and decision making, I designed and introduced a two-sided game to the junior course, and the faculty absolutely hated it because it was unstructured, and they had to think on their feet. They don't like that. They want to go into the seminars and cover the material via Socratic dialogue methodology, and that to me doesn't take students where they need to go.
So one of the questions I got is, what advice do you have for future wargaming directors at the college?
Wargaming directors at the college. Well, first of all, they are most likely not going to be designing true educational games. They're going to be designing games on contract from OpNav or one of the fleets. And I will say that fortunately, that the college, the relationship of the Wargaming Department and the Center for Naval Warfare Studies and the fleets is good. So the fleets come to the War College or for help, or the War College sends its gamers and others out to the fleet to help them. So that's a bright spot. At one point, one of my faculty members, Will Bundy, who is also running an advanced research group on mostly on ballistic missile defense, designed and directed a globally distributed war game on integrated air and missile defense, sponsored by the 4-star General Hawk Carlisle, who was PACAF. So the Naval War College did a globe-girdling IAMD game for the Air Force, and it was very successful. It actually changed joint doctrine and settled a dispute between the Air Force and the Navy over who commands and controls ballistic missile defense ships. So the game designers in the wargaming department, I couldn't offer advice to do any better than they're doing with regard to the fleet. What they aren't doing, and what they aren't going to be allowed to do, in as far as I can tell, is design really good educational games for War College students.
So one of the next question is, do you see parallels in the assessment or criticism of U.S. naval wargaming in higher naval educational institutions of other countries? They give an example of Canada's Maritime Warfare Center.
Well, I used to, my experience is now ancient, but I used to go over to the German Armed Forces Staff College and lecture there and sit in on their war games. And because it was Germany, and because politics were the way they were at the time, this was the 1990s, their games they never got to war. They were always crisis games that led up to, but didn't actually get into war fighting. And this was because it was Germany and their history. I was a student at the Spanish Naval War College way back in the early 80s, and we did a war game there. That was actually a kind of a tactical game. I was commander of their battle. Well, I wasn't commander of their battle group. I can't remember. They had this little retreaded American escort carrier that they put some Harriers on. What was it? The Principe de Asturias, I think it was called. The Harriers didn't have much in the way of range or capability, but in that war game, they moved it around, adjudicated it like it was a U.S. carrier battle group. It had way more influence than it would actually have. So there was some kind of unrealistic wargaming going on in Spain. There's other long stories associated with that. But as far as Canada, the UK, other countries, I really don't know what their practice is now. But I'll tell you, every country has its blind spots and its internal issues. So the only place I know of where wargaming occurs the way I've talked about it is down at Quantico in the Marine Corps.
Yeah, so the Marine Corps does great gaming down at Quantico. So this next question is in reference to your 2017 failings article that you mentioned in your presentation. I
Yeah.
believe it's called War Game Rules and Intellectual Catalyst. They ask, can you expand or explain more on your thinking as to creating the right conditions for students in and out of the game to facilitate this approach of getting that your intellectual catalyst that you mentioned?
Yeah, the war games don't exist in isolation. In other words, students have to be prepared in a lot of ways to participate in a war game, and then after the war game, that their experience has to be exploited. In other words, you've got to leverage their wargaming experience in subsequent seminars, I guess, to bring things out. So in a board game where you have to think through setting up the rules. Now, admittedly, I had no idea that the command and control budget rule that Peter Perla developed was going to have the effect it did. So you've got to be ready to exploit things that you see happen. Nonetheless, in designing a game, you can think your way through what you want, and you can just try some rules to see what they do. I mean, it's cheap and easy. Students, though, have to be prepared to play the game. Now, that's both in substance of the material that you want them to play. So, you can't take students that don't know anything about the military and make them play a military game, because they won't get anything out of it. They won't know the significance of what's happening. So the students have to be prepared in one way or another to play the game, both in substance and in of course the rules. You don't want them walking in not knowing the rules. So there's got to be some prep that way. And of course you want to keep the rules as simple as possible, but nonetheless, they need to walk in the door to the wargaming room prepared both in substance and in the rules. Then the faculty or the umpires, whoever's administering or executing the game as umpires or whatever, have to have some degree of understanding of the subject matter and the rules also. And then afterwards, that's where the real opportunities lie, in exploiting what happened in the game. And there you need really good faculty, experienced, knowledgeable faculty to exploit the experience that the students just had.
So on that note, this other question is sort of related to educational games, in the sense that have you seen, when running simulations or games in PME settings at the War College, is there a difference in play or learning or even approach towards wargaming in an educational setting between civilian students and uniform members?
Let me describe that the answer to that in terms of the games we ran. in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. After the attacks, a couple months later, both the police department and fire departments in New York came to us saying that, well, we've lost a lot of our leadership because they were leading from the front. So when the towers came down, we were kind of decapitated. And word of mouth says you guys could help us in a rather quick manner reconstitute our leadership. And so for the next year, over a year, we ran a series of war games for both the fire department and police departments of New York to rebuild their leadership structure and to help them understand the military concept of operational art, the use of forces, large forces over time and across a wide area. Both departments were tactically world class at the firehouse and precinct level, but they didn't have a clue at the all city level. So we got these guys together, and they're civilians really, although they're semi-military, I guess. The fire department and police departments each had around 40,000 members. But they came in ready, willing, and able with a really good attitude to learn. And that seems to be the key is willing and able to learn, and with some conception of hierarchical organizational relationships. Our experience was a little bit different when we also, at the same time, really ran a series of Homeland Maritime Security games to figure out how the Coast Guard and the Navy and really the FBI and a whole bunch of other agencies were going to achieve maritime homeland security, prevent terrorists from smuggling bad people and bad things into the U.S. And there we did have a bunch of civilians, the next class down, I guess you'd call it, government civilians who were also, used to a hierarchical organizational structure, and they kind of jumped into it, although it took a little bit of instruction, extracurricular instruction on telling them what wargaming was all about and how to craft moves, etc. I guess then the most civilianized gaming we did was back. We did a series of war games that brought in to examine maritime security. That we brought in representatives from Walmart, Sears, CSX, as well as Maersk, and the whole idea was to look at the flow of goods and of maritime commerce goods, and that took, some of the civilians had no clue as to how everything worked or any clue as to how organizations related to each other. They were commercial kind of guys that required some amount of briefing and instruction beforehand in order to get them to be able, in the right frame of mind, to relate to other organizations.
So the next question asks, is the school, which I assume is the Naval War College, providing any instruction for the officers on how to war game in fleet training exercises, in the evaluation of courses of action, or how to use gaming in training workups and certifications?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I devised and taught for several years a wargaming theory and practice course. And I think when I left, one of the guys in the wargaming department took it up, but I'm not sure right now whether that elective is being taught. It is certainly not embedded in any of the core courses.
So the next question asks, what is the Navy War College's relationship with the Maritime Operations Center and its Expeditionary Support Team?
Yeah. Okay. The there is at Newport a separate entity from the teaching curriculum. Let's call the teaching area of the college the Dean of Academics. And the research arm is the Center for Naval Warfare Studies. Then there is a third organization. It's called the College of Maritime Operational Warfare. And it's got its own building. And what they do is teach Joint Force Maritime Component Commander courses. And they have two very nice, big simulated maritime operations center. And they run, I think their courses run somewhere between 3 weeks to 12 weeks, depending on the course. So there is a separate teaching program at the college oriented on the GIFMIC and the Maritime Operations Center. That would be characterized as much training as education, but nonetheless a good thing. But it's certainly not the core course at the War College. It seems to be a proclivity of the college when some new need arises, they respond to the need by creating a different branch that handles it independently from the regular teaching. They don't try to solve or respond to emergent needs with their core course. They respond by creating a new branch. So they have a branch that handles leadership training. They have a branch that handles senior enlisted training or senior enlisted education, etc. All these are not directly connected to the core course. Having said that, the wargaming department at the college has the capacity to simulate maritime operations centers also, and in some of the war games that will happen. Although I would say the majority of the games that they run are seminar games. In other words, they're not trying to simulate a particular command and control entity. The gaming rooms may represent a GIFMIC or a JFAC, a Joint Air Force, a Joint Air Component Commander cell, or even a submarine cell, but they're not trying to simulate the real thing. They're just groups of people that represent those entities.
So you mentioned unlisted wargaming. So how do you see wargaming being used in the enlisted ranks beyond the halls of the Naval War College?
Well, training war games are used extensively in the fleet to develop competence with particular warfare systems. Now, the Senior Enlisted Academy at Newport, we actually scored a bit of a wargaming triumph there. We designed a rather abstract board game at the strategic level. It was I can't remember the name of it, Seas Bolo Island or something like that. But it was a game that a board game whose rules included all dimensions of strategy: military, economic, political, informational, etc. And it was only a day-long war game, but we had the Senior Enlisted Academy classes play the game, and they loved it. And I think it was very successful in teaching them the broad outlines of national strategy.
So I have a great question. As we wait for our last minute questions is, are there any recommended off-the-shelf games for training naval officers?
Well, the standard used to be Harpoon. I think Tom Clancy was involved in that, and I can't remember all the characters. And I think Harpoon still exists. And there's a number of games out there. I couldn't tell you which ones, but I will say the problem with computer-based games, generally speaking, is that they tend to be first-person shooters. In other words, even if it's a so-called fleet game, you got to sit there and act like the tactical action officer on every individual ship and develop fighting, decide when you're going to fire missiles, where you're going to put the ships and all that stuff. They're not operational level or strategic games as much as they would like to think they are. They're not. It all boils down to pressing buttons and firing missiles mostly. It would take a board game like the old Avalon Hill game of Midway or the Battle of Jutland game to simulate naval warfare at the operational or strategic levels.
So the next question says, do simulations offer any valuable insights that war games cannot provide, or are they only suited for certain purposes?
I don't think there's any such thing as an all-purpose war game, regardless of how it's designed or executed. Each one has its uses, and I hope I brought that across in the presentation, that there are uses for computer-based simulation games, but they can't do everything, and there are uses for board games, and they can't do everything, but each one has its uses. There are also uses for the most common kind of game, I guess you'd see in the Department of Defense, which is the game in which players submit, in cells submit their moves, kind of free form, and a group of umpires adjudicates what happened and feeds the results back to the players, so that players don't need to learn rules for the game. And the players in those kind of games, they may have common operational pictures, they may have computer support, that or they may not. But the game environment is essentially the same regardless. It's a game in which players submit moves free form and umpires adjudicate it in a game room somewhere that the players can't see. So those are basically three types of games. The computer games, are ones where in the Army Command and Staff College used to run these. I don't know if they do now. That they had a computer simulation, and the players typed their moves into the computer, so they could only type in moves that the computer could digest, and then the computer spit out results that it could calculate. So three different types of games, none of which is an end-all be-all game. Although I would say that the kind where you have a game room full of umpires and players submitting their moves free form is probably the most flexible type of game. It can achieve more objectives than the others can, probably.
Great. So Barney, as we wrap up our session today, I want to ask, what is one of the things you're most excited about, hopeful about educational wargaming in the Navy, at the Naval War College, or just like in the Joint Force writ large?
I guess I'm most excited about the way the Marine Corps does their job down there in Quantico in terms of gaming, and I'm hoping it will serve as an example for the Navy and the other services. But right now, I can't say I'm optimistic about the Navy in terms of its use of war games to support education. It uses war games well institutionally to support, fleet development and supporting the fleet directly. But in terms of supporting education, it's a non-starter. The Marines have it about right. And if I had any advice for the Navy, it's go down to Quantico and learn what they do.
So what I heard from you, Barney, is that the Marine Corps is just doing it better than the Navy.
Yep. That's, I hate to say that being a 30-year Navy guy, but I'm calling it like it is.
I appreciate it. Well, on the behalf of the Georgetown University Wargaming Society, I wanted to thank you for your wonderful presentation and sharing your many years of expertise with us. And I'll send you the link later. And for those who are joining us on YouTube, you can also find this presentation later on our YouTube page, but also the slides will be available on our Google Drive.
And I'd say good luck to you all. I think you all got a great future studying wargaming. Make a difference out there.